Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all this afternoon. Maybe to get started, it would be helpful to just get a quick kind of bio and a little bit of a background on what you've done and what you're doing currently.
Sure. So my name is Mandeep Singh. I'm a senior tech analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence covering technology. And I look at companies both from a financial perspective as well as, try to glean trends around what's upcoming, where they're investing in. And happy to, talk about what I'm seeing, focusing on the media industry in particular.
Great. My name is Francesco Marconi. I'm the R&D chief at the Wall Street Journal, where I lead a team of data scientists and automation editors. Our team builds machines to help journalists find stories, so we are fully dedicated to the newsroom and supporting journalistic endeavors. And prior to that, I was at the Associated Press, and I see some of my colleagues there, focusing a lot on automation through natural language.
Hi, I'm Nick Katsivelos. I'm a digital advisor at Microsoft Services, so working with our top customers in the area of digital transformation, harnessing the cloud and AI, and moving forward. I focus on the media industry, and I'm very glad to be here. Before that, I spent 35 years, it seems, in digital agencies around back from the sort of mid-'80s. So it's a nice jump to see this stuff scale up now.
Great.
And I think you all know me so far. If you just got here, I'm Justin Hendrix. I'm Executive Director of New York City Media Lab. And should I maybe just go into
this?
Yeah, so maybe just to get started. So I kind of proposed this idea in conversation with some of the folks at Bloomberg when we were putting the conference together this year to kind of just think about what the big tech companies are doing with regard to R&D and how that might impact media. So I've got a couple of slides. I don't know, Erica, if you're back there ready to show one, but just in terms of the overall R&D spending, I thought it was worth just looking at these billions and billions that are being spent by companies like Amazon, Alphabet, Samsung. This particular chart was noting Apple's growing expenditure on R&D. And a lot of that, now being spent on AI and other areas, AR, VR, a lot around connected car, IoT, and smart cars, as it were. And so it's just really interesting to me, when you add up the amount of R&D spending, in some cases, these are many, many times some of the largest media brands, the total revenue that we know of. So that's kind of worth noting. And then just on the next slide, this was just for instance. This is just a for instance. This is something actually published by Bloomberg today. I don't know if you saw this article, but I noted it in my Twitter feed this morning. But this is an image out of an Amazon patent that Bloomberg reported on, a wearable device that reads human emotions. So just a mechanism here for kind of doing a bunch of different things at the same time, but connecting a device with the Alexa in kind of this chain of communication. Very interesting there. We know Amazon's putting huge sums of money into AI. On to the next slide. This is a leaked image from Apple. People say this might be the next AR headset we should all get excited about. And we don't know if this is real or not, but certainly the company that's spending as many billions as they are in device innovation, it's possible to imagine. And then when you look at further out patent filings, this is one from Samsung. Not physically possible, I don't think at the moment, but it's a contact lens interface, which they imagine will be on the market at some point. So anyway, I just wanted to throw this up there as maybe a little way to frame this conversation. We've had some great discussion this morning about what's possible near term, what we're doing with computer vision, et cetera. But when you really kind of stretch your mind and think about the R&D priorities of these massive tech companies, we just wanted to prompt the conversation.
Yeah, so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit and dig right into kind of what are the trends that we're seeing. Where are we seeing the big tech companies making a lot of investments and making a lot of headway, and how is that necessarily or potentially helping media companies that are potential consumers of that technology?
Sure, I can start. So it's interesting that we started off with R&D spending. I would layer on the capital expenditure spending that these companies are doing, and it will be pretty much the same set of companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, And if you add up R&D and CapEx, because they are intertwined, to me, cloud is, half data center spending, half R&D spending, and then you keep layering services on top of it. So annually, these companies are spending close to $50 billion if you add R&D and CapEx. And I think there is a clear trend towards decoupling software from hardware. I mean, if you go back in time, traditionally all the software that was written was optimized for a particular type of hardware. And I think with cloud, one of the things that we are seeing is the homogeneous nature of the hardware is going away. So you're seeing, okay, there is a GPU now. Tomorrow there could be another type of chip, an accelerator. And what's happening with cloud specifically is, these companies which have set up these large data centers can do it at a much more, scalable level, much more optimized level than individual enterprises can upgrade their infrastructure. So everything around patching, everything around just kind of the DevOps side of things is being automated. And it's being automated through a combination of, cloud and just kind of how we are, how fast we are developing these new chips, which we want to decouple with the application. So that's trend number one. It's very important to kind of see where things are going in terms of, spend infrastructure side. You're going to see the hyperscale guys dominate, and they will keep leveraging, the latest chips and kind of deploy it for a broad audience. And that's why you see the nature of workloads are changing. I would say in terms of media specifically, when you look at the content, how it was being delivered before, it was through broadcast, now it's all streaming. And that's a big change, when you think about how content is being curated, how it's being distributed. A lot of that is being enabled by cloud. And what cloud gives you is not only kind of rich experience when you're consuming that content, it also gives you a lot of metadata. Who is consuming that content? What part are they liking it? Just everything that you want as somebody who wants to analyze, how your content is being consumed. There is so rich metadata. So that's where the analytics comes into play. And a lot of these companies are deploying analytics services where if you're running the workloads on cloud, guess what? You can do the analytics around how your content is being consumed in a very easy way. So I'll take a pause there because there's a lot of kind of secular shift. There's a big secular shift in terms of how content is being consumed, distributed, and that's not going to change. That's, I think, going forward, more and more traditional media companies are going this route. They want to go the streaming route, and we have the bandwidth, we have the capabilities. Now it's about how you, channel it to different types of content. I mean, gaming is another example of that, and that will just keep evolving.
Right.
Yeah.
Francesco, to you.
Yeah, I'll double down on cloud infrastructure. I think that's one of the most important investments by big tech, at least from our perspective. So we focus on applied AI. So we want to act fast and align with the speed of the new cycle. So it's not that our function of R&D is necessarily developing models from scratch. We are instead looking at solutions that are already available out there, both from big tech organizations, but also from the open source community. And we really focus on sort of the last mile, the last 20%, which is to adjust those models, adjust those capabilities to the tools that we are trying to build. From my perspective, again, I think natural language in natural language processing and deep learning are some of the biggest areas of opportunity for media, specifically news media. And there's incredible value in data that can be unlocked by analyzing different types of formats, text, images, video, and so on. And I think that's, we always talk about, the tension between the media organizations and the big tech companies that have those big budgets to invest in R&D. But I think from media organizations' standpoint, there's a big value proposition, which is all the assets that we have. So like if you're operating a newspaper, you have a huge archive of text data, and you have photos and you have videos. That's incredibly important to to train and refine models. And that's why, in a way, that's the things that we focus on, where we are taking a pre-packaged model and then we really refine it to the use cases of in my team of the Wall Street Journal, for example. So again, I really think AI, cloud AI, is completely transforming how easy it is for any organization to build these tools, these capabilities, and we'll be seeing more of that in the near future.
So Nick, coming from a large tech company yourself, right, where do you see the trend in terms of supporting media services, which I guess is core to your role?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things, right? It's a big company, and there's so many places where we cross into the media industry. But in a forward-looking research way, there's quantum computing. So as we talk about power, and that game changer, but further out, moving closer, cognitive services, deep learning and machine learning models that we have that are available, which are pretty general purpose. We're finding that the accessibility of that technology and those capabilities isn't always there for. Part of our mission is really to democratize these technologies, and so without a big budget in a media company, how do the smaller budget media companies take advantage of these? And so we're starting to work on ways of chaining together a lot of the services that we have and make them easier to use. Video Indexer is one case in point, where you drop in a video file and it does everything from facial recognition, speech to text, sentiment analysis, all that anyone can use with no training at all. And that metadata stream that comes out of that is fantastically important. And I think the point about effectively in a studio, the vault, or in a news organization, all the past content you've got is a tremendous asset that's really undervalued and underutilized because it's just opaque. It sits in file cabinets and on hard drives and things. And this ability to then go in and discover the assets, make the connections, is really fantastic. And then on the consumption side, new ways to package that information, allow people to interact with it and consume it. And then the feedback loop, of course, of consumption behavior to get back into the production loop. So we're touching everything from concept to creation and then broadcast or distribution and consumption. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I'm interested in this conversation is really the interaction, and I don't know if the two of you have interacted, for instance, but between the big tech companies and media companies, the extent to which that sort of defines the rules for media, and the ecosystem and economics of media. So I don't know, I'd kind of challenge my fellow panelists to talk about that subject if they're comfortable doing.
I guess I can start, but in the last few years, you have seen the big technology companies proactively reaching out to media organizations as they are developing solutions. So that's definitely a plus. But I still think there's a lot of work to do in terms of really helping understand how these models are built. A little different than basically deploying these capabilities is another area of focus of my team, which is really trying to understand how algorithms work. This idea of the algorithmic beat. Actually, we have one of the leading experts in the room, Nick, who leads the computational lab at Northwestern. But essentially, it's this idea that the same way that you can ask questions to a human source, you should be able to ask questions to an algorithm. And that's crucial, that transparency and that accountability, as more and more news organizations are using those tools to report the story. So let's say you're analyzing a large data set of government documents, and it points out to some hidden connection between a politician and a businessman. As you're reporting the story, you also want to talk about the methodology, and you want to talk about how do you derive those results. And since most media companies don't have the budget to build their own models, again focusing on applied AI, we rely on a lot of these capabilities that the tech organizations develop. So this is more like a wish list, which is more transparency and more communication around the training, the data set, and the deployment of these solutions.
So what technology specifically are you seeing kind of move the needle from a media perspective? Or, obviously we talked a lot about cloud and how cloud has really changed the game in terms of storage and compute power and the ability to access information. You also mentioned how a lot of the larger tech companies are offering analytics on top of the content. So you can actually see who's reading your content, from where, for how long, and all of this other interesting metadata that is useful. Are any of those innovations really being additive to the business, helping move the needle from your perspective?
From my perspective, I think so. We play a different role. We're more, without making this a commercial, we're more of an enabler and looking to augment the capabilities of the different organizations. So we're not competing in the space, and because we're not the last mile, we're not the distribution point for most of this media, we're not a huge, Bing does some, but not as much as the others. But as far as we're seeing everywhere else from all the other people in other big tech, it's absolutely important. In the advertising industry, I mean, that the Facebook and Google, plus the agencies, how they interact is a whole interesting little issue there. So there's definitely value in that.
I would just add, when I look at different companies, Netflix is a great example of a company that knows what content is likely to do well. And so there are benefits like that when you look at the data advantage or the training data sets that they have. One of the things that helps them with operationally is kind of getting a feel for the right type of content, serving it to the right audience, and that reflects in the retention rates when you look at their subscriber numbers or how well the engagement is with their customer base. I think that's part of what analytics can do for you, and that's why all these companies are investing so much in AI, and I think that's really the prime advantage.
Yeah, I think there's a big point there. I use the Netflix model a lot. It's that they sit with the consumer. They see the complete behavior. They watch the search behavior for stuff that they have in inventory and don't have in inventory. So they know they really have the pulse of the demand and acceptance of content. And as a dual-sided platform, they were able to originally bolt on third-party content to get that pump moving, and now have the full cycle and have insights into the market that the studios never have, and are now moving into being a first-party producer. That's an incredible amount of power that shows where that data really can move stuff and change industries.
Yeah, from my perspective, the technology that has the most application and immediate application to news media, at least, is natural language processing. So that's where I've been spending a lot of my time focusing on, where we are analyzing vast amounts of data, not only external data in documents, but also our own content. And this might seem ambitious, what I'm about to say, but one of the big projects that we are working on is essentially developing Moneyball for journalism, not necessarily on the recommendation side, but really trying to identify the insights, the angles that the audiences are most interested to learn about, and rather than focusing on data-driven journalism, it's focused on data-informed journalism. So it's not that that we are that the journalists are looking at the dashboards and say, okay, I have to cover this specific angle. It's more like this is an hypothesis, And more specifically, if you take a large corpus of news data as an example, and you run different models, use natural language processing, use topic modeling, you're able to surface very granular clusters of information. And then if you compare those clusters, and a cluster could be like a group of articles, so articles about Brexit in the context of UK cabinet appointments, so that's specific, and then compare that with what type of engagement you are getting, then that's a signal to the journalist that, well, maybe this is an angle that is relevant to my audience. And that's really transformative, because if you are thinking about the media industry as from a macro level, from an economic standpoint, it's all about supply and demand. And one of the important roles of journalism is to answer questions and that audiences have. And if you have an indicator of interest, then you are able to better serve the needs of people that read your content.
And that's a case where volume really helps, right? When you think about volume, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? I was mentioning earlier that Bloomberg has more than 2 million stories available on our system every day. That's a lot of content, and clearly no one could possibly read all of that content. So we also employ a lot of those same clustering mechanisms to identify, well, what's thematic across all this content? What are people most interested in? What are publishers most talking about? And what seems to be growing in popularity? Because those are really good signals both for our customers who are looking for investment ideas, but also for our own journalists who are looking for what's the next angle to pitch, what's the next story to write. So I definitely can relate to that.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things I worry about a little bit in this regard, especially around news journalism, and this conversation, by the way, we can talk about entertainment, other forms of media, but we were talking a little bit earlier about the extent to which some of these things favor media companies that can invest in the types of R&D capabilities that the Wall Street Journal has or Bloomberg has or others, where you're creating content that is perhaps optimized to audience in a way that perhaps you can't do if you're in a smaller newsroom, maybe in the middle of the country or elsewhere, or in some other context. We've got hundreds of small newsrooms right here in New York City. I don't know to what extent you see that as a problem or an issue in media, Mandeep, or I just put that back to you guys as well.
I mean, again, everyone can kind of focus on their specific niche, and you see that across the board. Even if you go across industries, you have companies that pick a niche, try to, again, it goes back to training data. If you are trying to implement AI or machine learning, ultimately, it's the quality of your training data that will determine the results. So how you harness that training data, and in fact, Google, at the Google I/O, they were talking about doing AI at the edge now. So far it was about, okay, I'm going to try to aggregate all this information on the cloud, try to do this training over time, and collect a good training data that's representative of the population or the sample. But now they're able to kind of implement this at the edge. So it could be in your Alexa device, or it could be, and that's where it gets real time. Because if you're trying to serve up content real time, like you get it on Spotify, or any of the other content providers, it just, you have to look at, a broad set of vectors. And the only way you can do that is if you're matching that with your feature set in the training data, and that's really the secret sauce, that you're not going to figure it out on your own, but over time, if you can perfect that, that becomes a competitive advantage.
So are you just to push on that, are you saying kind of that some of these features capabilities may eventually favor local news and journalism if there's more context? Is that what you mean? Or in response to my question?
It's a broad set of vectors. So it's not just about the quality of the content, it's about mining the feature set in terms of the consumption patterns, in terms of how they're sharing the content. So there is a social media aspect of it, how they are sharing that content, and just kind of figuring out holistically, okay, this is how I would personalize this content for this particular person. So personalization, recommendation engine, all these things that you see on Netflix or Amazon, which we kind of are used to now, it took them a while to perfect it, in the sense, what are the things that will personalize the shopping patterns or the viewing patterns for this particular person? So the same thing, you have to do it when you're a content provider, even if it's a niche audience. You have to understand your audience, and that's where AI, machine learning can be very helpful.
That's right. There's also a whole ecosystem of companies that have been built that are specifically targeted at identifying usage patterns, maybe social listening tools and things like that on social media and other platforms that these smaller media companies can use to better understand how their content is resonating across the board. So that might also be another possibility of leveraging kind of the power of AI without necessarily needing to make the investment.
The other side of it is privacy. So I think that's where it gets tricky, what you are capturing, how you are using it, and I think that's where more and more we are seeing with GDPR and the other regulatory stuff that's coming about. There will be a line drawn somewhere. Okay, well, what's acceptable to capture and what you can harness and what you can't, and I think that's something that everyone has to be cognizant of.
Justin, I think that's the biggest challenge facing the news industry in the next 20 years, which is AI widening the gap between big media companies with some resources for R&D, not necessarily those big spendings that you showed on your chart, and smaller newsrooms. And it's like, just think about, if you're a wealthy investor, it's easier to make money because you can afford to diversify your portfolio. It's true that there are more tools available and that smaller news organizations can access, but there's also a knowledge gap. It's easier for us in this room, at least, to know what are the interesting, cool startups that are doing X, Y, and Z, but someone who is in the middle of the country, a small newspaper in Missouri or Illinois, they most likely will not know that these things even exist. So the gap in skill set, the gap in capabilities is going to drive large media organizations to be more successful, and then small news organizations to really fall behind. A few solutions for that exist. One of them is initiatives like NYC Media Lab, but it's serving a very specific community of a big city. But broadly speaking, collaborations between universities and in newsrooms. There's also a lot of investment, at least from foundations and big tech companies, in helping local journalism. But I really feel that we need something like an Associated Press for AI, where everyone can share capabilities and everyone can tap into those resources. But I'm not really concerned about job replacement or any of those dangers of AI. I think it's really widening the gap, and then eventually the downside of that is we'll have news deserts. There will be communities in the US that will not be served by journalism because simply there are no newspapers available.
So that's something. So there's a group that's forming at Microsoft now, Microsoft News Labs, and the mission there really is to address that gap and to empower the smaller players. With the notion, underpinning it all, ethical and inclusive platform, but the idea of restoring trust in the content, and then the truth in the content, and through that restoration, also restoring revenue, and then really helping build, the media and journalism industry and help them recover and get back. So. We see that, and we're hoping that we can help address that.
So with all of this innovation, right, there also comes opportunity, right? So there's obviously the downside of potentially kind of that widening gap. There's also the ability to look at a lot more content sets and a lot more data sets, and where possible by just humans, because now machines can assist in that process. Can you think of any applications where that's actually being implemented and helping to kind of share more information or make information that was otherwise not publicly available more easily publicly available?
In terms of capabilities that let you ingest large amounts of public data, structure it, make it searchable. I think that's highly relevant, not only for the media industry, but for all industries, and that's something that is nascent and that anyone can benefit from. That's a specific application.
I would just add, I look at company filings, press releases, and a lot of times sometimes you just miss it, in terms of what's important. So AI and machine learning can, if they know what I'm interested in, they can serve up the content much better. And I feel like it's sorted in a way where the content is served in the right order over time if I define my preferences correctly, and that's one of the advantages.
It's interesting. It kind of loops back also to the question of 2 million stories a day and you having to decide what to show to who. I mean, I'm noticing it personally using aggregation services that I'm ending up in these bubbles where I am not seeing stuff and I'm being force-fed things that I may have watched. The signal is weak or noisy, and now it makes the entire service unusable. And the lack of transparency of why I'm being served this and my ability to push back and be part of the feedback loop. It's a tough problem at a user experience level. It's a tough problem just managing all that additional signal. So it's, we're getting started, but there are problems with it right now as it's being applied, and we have to all keep an eye on that kind of stuff.
So we talked a lot about kind of some of the technologies that are being heavily leveraged that are really helping companies grow. Are there any technologies that you can think of that maybe are a bit overhyped or too early, right? We hear a lot about autonomous cars. We've been hearing about them, for the last 20 years or 15 years, it feels like, yet really hasn't fully materialized. Maybe soon, but not quite. Is there anything like that applies to the media space where there's just technology that maybe isn't as easily implementable as one would think?
I mean, I can start. So I think the whole thing about IoT and AR and VR. In fact, I actually believe we are probably early into how AR and VR will be used in mobile ads. But the future is, once you get to a point where the device is good enough to support, AR type of rendering, we will be seeing more and more of those ads. And Snapchat and some of the companies have tried a lot of, AR-based ads. But I think all this will take time to kind of get there. And a lot of it is determined based on the device capabilities and, what consumers are using. But probably we are early into these trends then, and we will see over time that this will play out, but probably it's too early to call that.
I would say synthetic media, so essentially using AI to modify video and photo content. There's a lot of discussion about the dangers of deep fakes, so AI-powered fake news. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal launched an initiative in a committee where we are training journalists to learn about detection mechanisms in media forensics. But the reality is that it's still very nascent, and we'll likely see it come to full fruition in the next 2 or 3 years. But I think that's an area that I think it's right that it's hyped, because there are a lot of dangers, specifically when it comes to misinformation. But there's also a lot of opportunities, specifically for entertainment in video creation. So, from Hollywood studios using these mechanisms, these algorithms to, let's say, change a day in a shoot from a rainy day to a sunny day. That can really cut costs. There's also a lot of development in synthetic voices that are being used for video game development to voice the characters. That type of technology is still, again, very early on, but it's something to keep an eye on. So.
For me, and this is probably a personal opinion more than anything else, is the notion of AI as being something that's going to allow you to get real insights about yourself and help. And that being because in order to get full context of who you are and make a recommendation on something like, why did I not sleep well last night? My sleep number bed knows a little, my watch might know something, but it's not taking into account my financial portfolio performance, the sentiment analysis of my communications, what I ate for dinner, and my kids' grades, and then the local news, right? Those are the things that actually make my psyche happen, and it's not necessarily just the temperature in my room. So until you can get that personal data set and have it in your control, and allow the AI to work within your own context in a protected and private way, I don't think we're going to see the sort of help that people imagine, that the machine is going to anticipate your needs and be able to serve them. And that data siloing is something that's coming under challenge by things like GDPR, and companies really have to think long and hard about what personal data and what and metadata and behavioral data they want to keep on their customers, because at some point it's a liability. And changing things, and I look at identity too, and the moves that are happening in decentralized identity are all critically important. And how do you make that happen, and how do you empower the individual to capture the data about themselves and use it for themselves with the tools that they want? Until we get to that, this notion that the robot butler is going to come and give me what I want when I walk in the door is just not going to happen.
Yeah. I guess I'd just add, we've talked a lot about this morning already, but the synthetic media, I think that's the, by the way, it's a new way of even talking about a set of trends, I think, which kind of, it blends data and AI and deep learning and all this stuff with the kind of like augmented reality and virtual and the rest of that. But the synthetic media topic, to me, is the one that probably changes media the most in the next decade, probably changes the economics of the media industry the most, and the way we create media, as we've discussed already this morning. So to me, that's when we've started a synthetic media working group. We're about to do a kind of online email course around it. There's a bunch of interesting things happening around it. BetaWorks is doing a conference on it soon. And there's lots going on in that space, and that strikes me as the most interesting area.
And I guess for one last question, what technologies do you see as kind of nation now that have the most potential? So, we were talking a little bit earlier about this idea where the big tech companies create infrastructures and base models, right? Like I think of Google AutoML, where then other companies can add their own content and customize those models to their particular use case. For example, translating content into the financial domain, which is something we're doing, but lots of other applications across different industries. So that's one technology that I think is relatively early, but could really help to fuel both large media organizations as well as smaller ones. Are there any technologies that stick out to you that you think are kind of at the cusp or just beginning to be utilized that have so much more promise?
And I can start. So I think one of the things that I see, especially when it comes to the hyperscale cloud vendors, is they want to expose everything in the form of APIs. Not everything is fully developed, and what they're trying to do is to test the waters. Okay, if they were to roll out, this feature set, and everyone has an AR kit now, what they want to do is to be able to create that platform where their infrastructure is being used for pretty much everything, plumbing that needs to be done to get that workload up and running, and then give you the basic set of services that you can use to create a particular application. So having that API framework is extremely important, and I think that's where you're finding a lot of Alexa use cases. I personally think digital assistants are going to be used more and more. And again, it goes back to how you personalize the content. It doesn't have to be a click-based interface. It could be a voice-based interface. And once you are okay with the privacy settings and how you interact with that digital assistance, it's going to help you personalize and save time. And I think that's where you're going to see some development in the next few years.
Going back to the AI infrastructure that the tech companies provide, that's enabling startups and smaller ventures to develop hyper-focused, hyper-specialized tools for niche problems in specific industries. So a tool that does summarization for the financial sector and, in a very, very specific way. And so I think in the next 3 to 5 years, you'll see all of these tools, all of these startups bubbling up that target, again, very specific opportunities. And eventually you'll see consolidation where, either a Microsoft or a Google or some other entity comes in and says, well, this piece fits here within the larger workflow, in our case, the media organization, and you'll see that consolidation. So I think that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I going back to a point you made earlier, I think NLU, natural language processing, natural language understanding, is a key driver, along with things like image recognition, all of which, right now they support a very general use case out of the box, and then getting into the niche applications where people are tuning them. If I'm someone who makes tractors and I do image recognition and I have 500 models, it's not going to recognize that fine definition, but I can train the model to really know my stuff as well. Likewise, in the natural language space, developing the new ontologies that you need to understand a given niche space, and even company by company, that's a very difficult process. You need these niche companies to go in that have really deep understanding and develop those ontologies and custom models. And then I agree, at some point there will be a roll-up of people to say, yes, we service these sectors and we have the best ontologies and we have the best understanding of what your business is. And it applies, outside media, it applies everywhere.
I guess I just maybe make a plug for a capture technology, since we've talked mostly about AI and NLP and the rest. Bill Platt, who runs the volumetric meetups here, we see a lot of companies doing really interesting stuff with 3D motion capture and volumetric capture, really experimenting in that. Still difficult, still expensive, still difficult to make great things. Some folks on the Times are here who've done some good stuff in their mobile app with volumetric assets. But I think we'll see a lot of emphasis on that as a way to kind of bring that synthetic media, and 3D thing together over the next few years. So.
Excellent. I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any questions in the audience. Yes. Sorry, if you could just hold for a microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, thank you. Francesco, you talked about Moneyball for the newsroom. Now, baseball, the rules are clear. What are you optimizing for in the newsroom?
Let me start by saying that we are not optimizing, we are developing hypotheses for things that might be relevant. From core foundational things like the story length, to the writing style, to the ratio, to essentially the story structure. So when is the first source introduced? What's the nature of the story? Is it analysis? Is it a longer feature? Is it spot news? And so there's all of these ingredients that are the secret sauce. If you join the Wall Street Journal, I'll tell you about it. But so looking at different, the same way if you are an editor, you have an instinct for what stories work well, but you're looking at overall, do you start the story with an anecdote, or do you start the story with a fact or a data point? So all of those different dynamics within the story.
But how do you measure success? Is it then just views? Is it shares? What is the
conversion rates? So the Wall Street Journal is a subscription business. So we are looking at the number of new members, as well as reducing the churn. So people that unsubscribe.
Yes, there's a question over there.
Hi there. So piggybacking on that question, I actually wanted to know, how does a platform like Apple News Plus impact that in that case? Because now you can access Wall Street Journal on that platform instead of subscribing separately.
How does it impact?
Like just Yeah, our readership, like increasing readership and subscription rates, if we can just get all of our news in one source that way instead of separately directly through Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, I mean, so you are referring to a partnership that Wall Street Journal announced with Apple News. There are other news publishers, including the LA Times, as well as many magazines. The strategy there is to expand our reach, and essentially it's a new distribution mechanism for us. The way that we are seeing is that there are different tiers of subscription, and think about it as a funnel. So at the top of the funnel, you are subscribing to Apple News, and you are getting a curated set of content, and then there's other content and products that we offer. So.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yes, there's a question here in the front. Sorry.
Thank you. So, essentially, a lot of that we've been talking today is how do we produce more content using GANs and whatnot. And I would be interested in learning how do we produce less content, meaning that, I mean, obviously part of the problem is that the incentives in the internet, not really journalism per se, but in the internet, that people are used to not paying for quality content. And as a result, we're driven towards producing more and more of lesser and lesser quality. So I think an interesting discussion is how do we try to revert the process, and what would be the differences between using the tools for content generation to help the creators which can actually produce high quality content and not machine generated nonsense.
So this is one of the things John talked about at the very beginning. This is a big problem. It's a perfect question. I think we're probably going to be doing both at the same time, as we kind of always have. There's going to be more and more use of these tools to create high quality content that can be relied upon, that may be more expensive, and there's going to be a cacophony of content produced that will satisfy folks' base needs and intentions, and we're going to have to figure out that world. I don't have a good answer for you. I think that's what we're here to talk about.
Maybe add to that a little bit. I think at Bloomberg, some of the things that we're doing on our platform is basically aggregating content, and so ensuring that we deduplicate content so the user doesn't see the same story 5 different times. So our focus is really on improving the user experience so that they can consume as much content without necessarily needing to read every single story. So things like clustering and deduplication really help kind of synthesize that, as well as the more signals we get in terms of what's relevant, what people are reading, what they're finding useful, that can also help to kind of educate reporters on where to focus their time and maybe where to spend less time and where to invest more. So those might be some of the methods where I think technology can really give us an edge on understanding what users are looking for and how to customize our content for those use cases. All right, so I think we're out of time. First of all, I want to thank the panel so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.
Okay.